morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And we'll continue where we left off yesterday, actually backing up a paragraph for continuity, in the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, talking about a period of time when revolution had gripped all of Europe. Europe, following the example of the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant reformers, threw off the yoke of papal bondage and papal tyranny, the temporal power of the Pope, the kingly power of the Pope who had oppressed the people by the justification of his so-called self-arrogated spiritual power. This is the great error of all of Europe and even the United States today. Those who believe that the Pope is somehow a representative or replacement of Christ on the earth, that he speaks with the voice of Christ, and that he ought to be obeyed unquestioningly in everything having to do with spiritual things and temporal things. The Pope is not the replacement of the Son of God on earth. He is the Antichrist. Always has been, always will be. And not realizing this, Europe is comfortable to remain under the Pope's spiritual authority, but they want to throw off the Pope's temporal authority. They want to have some say in their own governments. And the Pope cannot maintain his spiritual authority over the people without his temporal power, the power to solicit the help of armies to defend both his temporal and his spiritual power. Okay? He doesn't rely upon God to preserve his position and authority in the world, either spiritually or temporally. He relies on military might. And we're getting into examples here, then I'll make comparisons with the United States today, the great military power on the earth, of whom the papacy avails itself to maintain both its spiritual and temporal power in the world and to expand his temporal dominions, his jurisdiction over the world. Now, backing up a paragraph where we left off yesterday, at the bottom of page 278, if you're following along, the last full paragraph, it says, France and Belgium, having therefore both accepted revolution as a remedy for grievances which could no longer be endured, it excited no surprise when the same sentiment was imparted to other Roman Catholic populations in Europe. One second. I seem to have a lot of noise. Let me reconnect. Hang on, will you please? Okay, much better. Now we'll continue. France and Belgium, having therefore both accepted revolution as a remedy for grievances which could no longer be endured, it excited no surprise when the same sentiment was imparted to other Roman Catholic populations of Europe. The masses were moved almost everywhere by the impulse to escape the influences of the old regime, the old world order, and place themselves under institutions of their own creation, responsible only to themselves. The people of the different nations were beginning to understand and to sympathize with each other more than ever before. They were coming nearer together by means of the facilities of intercommunication for which they were indebted to the spirit of Protestant progress. Yeah, see, these Protestant nations who had loosened themselves from the iron chains of the Vatican, of the papacy, all of a sudden had money that would have ordinarily gone to the church to educate their children. And when their children became educated, every realm of life improved. Technology advanced. Means of communication were improved. And it was by these means of communication that all of Europe was now communicating this revolutionary attitude, this revolt against the papacy and his temporal power. He says that they were learning from the marvelous successes of the advancing nations that the real source of national greatness were in their own hands and depended for proper development upon themselves alone. In whatsoever direction they looked, they found evidences to assure them that these same successes could not be obtained without the constitutional guarantee of rights of the right of self-government. They knew self-government was their only answer. They had to create their own governments. They had to overthrow the papal monarchies and replace their kings and princes with those of their own choosing, those that would maintain and defend their liberties, their freedom from papal bondage. And having been brought to the conviction, no matter whether from choice or necessity, that they could more safely confide their temporal welfare to governments of their own construction than to either ecclesiastical or secular monarchs who traced their prerogatives of absolute imperialism to the divine law, they accepted revolution as a just and rightful remedy for their wrongs. So who were the governors that they reviled and wanted to replace with their own governors? Those who derived their power from the divine right, that believed that they had God's authentic choice and approval for their reign, that they were little Christs, much like a Roman Catholic priest who rules his church by divine right, the same divine right that the Pope has, because they get this divine right ultimately from the Pope. If the Pope were ever stripped of his self-arrogated divine right to rule, there would be no such thing as divine right of kings. No king could claim a temporal jurisdiction, a throne, a government by this so-called divine right. And without the divine right, the only thing that's left is for the people to choose their governors. Okay, this is part of the establishment of this thing we call Antichrist, or rather, the beast. The beast is the temporal governing authority of the Pope through the kings of the earth. That is the beast. When you read Revelation chapter 17, and it's described this woman riding the beast, the woman represents the harlot church, the Roman Catholic Church. What makes her a harlot? She's mixed the holy with the profane. She is an idolatrous church, an apostate church, one that is outside the will of God, that goes a whoring around after all other gods. That is the Roman Catholic Church. That's the woman, the scarlet harlot. And the beast that carries her is this monarchical system that upholds the temporal power of the Pope and imposes his diabolical will upon the people by force. Okay? Clearly described in the Bible, this very system that we're reading about in this book. Now, when France and Belgium had broken the scepter of absolutism, this is absolutism, you can liken in your mind as the divine right. When you have divine right to rule, you obviously have the right to expect absolute obedience. That's what the Pope requires, and that's what his kings required. It says, when France and Belgium had each broken the scepter of absolutism, their influence was soon imparted to the Roman Catholic populations of southern Europe, and they too, brooding also over the wrongs, began to gather up the weapons of revolution and prepare to use them. They moved slowly at first because the chains which bound them were tightly riveted. Rome doesn't let go of any of her slaves voluntarily. And it says, but they kept their eyes steadily fixed upon the constitutional governments and advanced cautiously towards a like fortune for themselves. They could not expect to go at once to the whole extent of establishing popular institutions in the American sense. Their education and forms of government to which they had become accustomed had left them in a condition which made extreme caution indispensable, for fear that by rash and precipitate action, the principles of the quote-unquote Holy Alliance might become so permanently established that church and state could not be separated, and they would be compelled to acquiesce in the doctrine of the divine right of kings as an essential part of the Christian faith, or make war upon the church, which they had taught to revere, and did, in fact, revere. The Pope was the recognized spiritual head of the church. Now, here's the crux of the matter. The Pope was recognized as the spiritual head of the church, and with that, they were content. All the people of Europe were content. The Roman Catholics of Europe were content that the Pope was the spiritual head of the church. That is the crux of the matter. If they could only have let go of the notion that the Pope is somehow the replacement of Christ on earth and speaks with the voice of divinity, they could have completely shaken off the papacy. With no one to worship the Pope dries up as a matter of default, okay, and blows away with the wind. But the people continued to revere the papacy as the voice of God on the earth. And therefore, the struggle for temporal authority by the Pope was a legitimate act from the papacy's point of view, because it's only through the temporal power that the Pope can maintain his spiritual power. When people regard the papacy as Antichrist, as did the Protestant reformers, they quit acknowledging the Pope's assumed temporal power. And the Pope has only one option at that point, and that is to raise up armies to either re-Catholicize these Protestants or extirpate and annihilate. And that is the entire history of the Roman Catholic Church. As soon as someone rebels, one group or another, whether it be the Waldenses, the Albigensians, the Hussites, we've named them repeatedly here on this program, whenever they take to reject the claim to spiritual authority, they automatically take away the Pope's temporal power as well. And that's where the Pope always relies on physical force, coercion, to either bring the people back under his sway and control or to annihilate them. That's why the earth is soaked with the blood of God's people, and until the world acknowledges that the Pope is nothing in the world but Antichrist, this struggle will continue. And nowhere more so than the United States of America. The book continues, he says, but he was also a temporal king in the states of the church. We're talking about the papal states here. And claimed that the authority pertaining to that position was divinely conferred. That's right, he believes that God gave him the divine right to rule the papal states and all the world, and included such spiritual sovereignty over the world as God himself possesses. In other words, he's God on earth. And that he was thereby made the infallible, quote, master of truth, unquote, and was entitled to uninquiring and absolute obedience, not merely in spirituals, but in such temporal matters as he alone should declare to be essential to the preservation and exercise of his imperial prerogatives. They had endured the evils of that form of government long enough. In other words, they were sick and tired of the old world order. And having contrasted their condition with that of the peoples who had entered upon the experiment of self-government, like those of the United States, they became convinced that they owed to themselves and their posterity the duty of undertaking the same experiment, even at the cost of revolution. Even at the cost of revolution. Now, interestingly, the condition of the United States is we started out with Protestantism. Now we're becoming Roman Catholic. We're becoming autocratic. We're becoming a papal state. And we can tell by this that it's going to take a revolution to throw off the chains that our government and the ecumenical evangelibellies, together with their apostate Antichrist Roman Catholic partners, are trying to bind us all. Revolution is the only hope. Without direct divine intervention, revolution, armed revolution, is the only hope. We're never going to negotiate freedom from the Pope or his temporal rulers in the United States. They believe they have divine right to rule. They get that divine right and benefit from the Pope. And this union of church and state that's now taking place in the United States cannot be broken by any other means. At least if history is the only indication we have, the only way to break this bondage is an armed revolution. Okay? The only other hope is that every man, woman, and child in the United States comes to understand this history and comes to understand that not only is the Pope not a temporal ruler anywhere in the world, but he's not a spiritual leader either. And if the whole United States were completely educated in this matter, as we are educating ourselves right here, right now on Inquisition Update, if the whole country would then, with that knowledge, just simply walk away from the papacy, not a shot would need be fired. There would be a successful, nonviolent revolution against the papacy. And of course, as we're going to see in the next chapter, that if that were ever the case, that the United States would again pick up its revolutionary spirit and identify that one who's trying to bind us all in iron chains once again, he would solicit the help of a foreign invasion to this country. And so long as Rome has sway in the government of the United States, that foreign invasion would be by the help of the United States government itself. That the United States government itself would call for help of a foreign military might to bring again the suppression of God's people in this country. He says all they could hope to do under the conditions surrounding them was to separate church and state, disavow and discard the doctrine of the divine right of kings as temporal rulers, whether ecclesiastical or secular, and substitute constitutional governments for absolute monarchism. In other words, to try political institutions for their own creation in place of the paternal government. The paternal government, in other words, the fatherly government, and most specifically, a papal government by which the papacy had kept them from advancing along with the progressive peoples who had asserted and maintained the right of self-government. Revolution was their only hope. To follow the example of those who had liberated themselves was going to require open confrontation. And it says, had not these populations the right to do this? The American Declaration of Independence asserts that this right is derived from the law of nature and is inalienable. The Holy Alliance of European sovereigns was organized to suppress it. The papacy and the Jesuits combined their energies to resist it as heresy. In other words, they are resisting this popular demand for self-government on the grounds of heresy. They are invoking religious conviction to suppress this popular demand for constitutional governments. The papacy hides behind a cloak of religion and draws out its religious sword every time it is threatened. History is conclusive in this matter. And again, the papacy and the Jesuits combined their energies to resist these revolutions as heresy. heresy against the church, heresy against the Pope, heresy against the divine right, and heresy against Christ. That's what the papacy claims. Every time a revolutionary spirit grips a people and they wish to have their own form of government. Now he says, there was therefore no middle ground between constitutional government and submission, between the continuance of the old order of things and the infusion of new life into decrepit and decaying institutions. Consequently, the people of Southern Europe had to make a choice between these alternatives at the risk of being denounced and punished as unfaithful and heretical revolutionists. You see, if they equivocated, if the Pope gained the upper hand, they would be treated as unfaithful and heretical revolutionists. It was either one or the other. Either come into complete submission to the church, or completely and successfully rebel against it and suppress the power of the Pope, or vacillate and become known as heretical revolutionists. That was the choices they had to make. The consequences and outcomes were matters of the gravest consequence. Just like the Revolutionary War that separated the colonies from England, all of Europe was facing. And many of them had the American Revolution in mind when they began to rebel against the papacy. Now, chapter 16 is entitled Revolutions in Southern Europe. It's a very interesting chapter. I hope my listeners will pay close attention. It says the successor of Pope Pius VIII was Gregory XVI, who became Pope in 1831. His election was not calculated to pacify the people or lessen the general excitement. On the contrary, he fully committed his pontificate to the policy of retrogression. Again, R.W. Thompson uses the term retrogression to refer to the old world order. And this was so well understood that he had to prepare at once to grapple with the revolution, so near the Vatican that he could witness the surgings of the enraged populations. That's right, Italy. The Pope's own people, all of them Roman Catholic, were rebelling against his temporal power. They wanted their own form of government. They were sick and tired of papal bondage. They still wanted to recognize the Pope as the head of the church and acquiesce to him in spiritual things, but they would not any longer tolerate his tyranny as a king, a temporal king. And so a revolution is taking place in Italy. Now we're going to see how the Pope put it down. We'll be back right after the messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a Left Behind rapture scenario. This false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media, is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. In the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you approve of Inquisition Update and would like to see it continue on First Amendment Radio, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And we thank Brother Nicholas for seeing the value of this information for God's people, and it's my pleasure and my responsibility to give it. Now, revolution has come to Italy. Roman Catholic Italy. The national religion of Italy is Roman Catholic. The Vatican is an enclave within the city of Rome. Yet the people of Italy wish to throw off the temporal power of the Pope and have their own experiment in self-government. The Italian people assumed the attitude of defiance. And if they had been hitherto disposed to submit passively to the oppressions of the papacy, it then became evident that they too, after centuries of obedience to the Pope as an absolute temporal monarch, were resolved to try the experiment of self-government under a written constitution. They had endured absolutism until they could do so no longer. The revolution broke out almost simultaneously at Bologna, Parma, and Modena, and very soon after at Rome itself. The Pope was unable to hold the insurgents in check in the latter city only by military force. But in the provinces, the popular tumult increased. It is said in behalf of Gregory XVI that the insurrection was occasioned without any personal enmity to the Pope, that, quote, it arose against the rule and not against the ruler, against the throne, not against the actual possessor. It aimed at the final overthrow of the reigning power, the substitution of a republic for the existing and recognized rule, unquote. Accepting this as true, and there's no reason to doubt it, it establishes the proposition clearly that the Roman Catholic populations of the Papal States entered upon the revolution for the purposes only of stripping the Pope of his temporal power, leaving his spiritual power undisturbed. And this is the fatal error of every revolution in history against the papacy. The only revolution that was successful against the papacy was the Protestant Revolution, and it was only because they threw off both the temporal and the spiritual authority of the papacy. Italy is doomed to fail because she still recognizes the Pope as the vicar of Christ. And it says, what followed is best interpreted in the light of this acknowledged fact. A modern author thus depicts the condition of affairs from which the people of Italy revolted. Quote, absolutism, administered by priests, was the system which prevailed in the states of the Church during the pontificate of Gregory XVI, and in no part of the peninsula, not even in Naples, were the people so oppressed and so ill-governed, unquote. The same author further says, quote, in Sardinia, even more than in almost any other portion of the peninsula, the Church enjoyed the exceptional privileges which she had acquired during the Middle Ages. The civil power had, in fact, no legal jurisdiction over the clergy. That's right. The clergy, the priests of the Roman Catholic Church are sacrosanct. They can commit any crime, and no civil authority has jurisdiction over them. They can commit the most heinous crimes, and no civil government, no civil authority, no police force empowered by the state has any jurisdiction. The Pope is its own jurisdiction, and the priest comes under the Pope's authority, not the government's authority. And they're tried by ecclesiastical courts. And the ecclesiastical courts, those favorable to the Church, are the ones who render judgment. The civil power is hands-off when it comes to the crimes of the priesthood. And that's why this pedophile pandemic of the Roman Catholic priests goes unchecked for centuries. No civil court has jurisdiction over these priests, not even the world court. It's only by the ecclesiastical authority of the Church are these priests ever brought to justice. And some justice it is. They're put up in country club-style retreat houses and treated like kings while they're counseled, and then turned loose after a predeterminate period of time to offend again and again and again and again. And the people are helpless to do anything about it, except to take the law into their own hands. And some have. But the government has no jurisdiction. No police force can bring these priests to civil justice. Now, all offenses committed by the ecclesiastics were tried by clerical tribunals, ecclesiastical courts acting upon the canon law and irresponsible to the state. They're held to be answerable to the Roman Catholic canon law, which is completely separate from state law, from federal law. Okay? They render their own judgments. The priests are immune from civil authorities. It says, moreover, these courts claimed and to some extent exercised jurisdiction over laymen accused of heresy, blasphemy, sacrilege, and other offenses against the church. So these ecclesiastical courts take over not only for the priests, but even in some cases against the laity of the church. Okay, it's another authority higher than the civil authority. The Pope can bring someone in on charges to be tried by an ecclesiastical court when the state would have nothing to do with arresting a layman for the charges as levied against him by the church. Now he continues, he says, as soon as the revolution was fairly inaugurated in all the cities of the legation, an insurrection army was marched toward Rome, avowing the purpose not to concede anything to the papacy, but to have the government reformed. Okay, these people are determined. They're going to have their own constitutional government, and the Pope can go suck an egg, right? It says the Pope soon saw that he was powerless to resist so formidable a force, and that his crown would be lost to him unless he could obtain assistance from some of the allied sovereigns. Remember the Holy Alliance? He's going to rely upon this Holy Alliance now. He says that is, unless he could subdue his own Roman Catholic subjects by the help of a foreign army. Notwithstanding he boastingly considered himself as armed with divine authority, he did not feel it safe in the face of the stubborn facts before him to rely alone upon assistance from that source. Okay? The Pope claims divine right and divine protection, but he never uses that protection because he's not really under God's protection at all. He has to rely on force, military force. Now look what he does. He says he had more confidence in military than in spiritual power in dealing with a population he knew to be incensed with the outrages committed by the government he defended. He accordingly called upon Louis Philippe of France to send an army to Italy to punish his own Roman Catholic subjects, because they desired only to take the crown of temporal sovereignty from his head, leaving his spiritual rights unassailed. He relied upon the pledge which the Holy Alliance had exacted from the sovereigns, that they would intervene forcibly when necessary to protect the monarchism wheresoever popular and constitutional government was set up against it. And of course, in making this appeal to the King of France, must have supposed that he occupied firm ground. So the Pope is going to use a foreign army to bring his own people into subjection. And it says, but France by this time had learned to look upon the doctrines of the Holy Alliance with disfavor. And when she expelled Charles X, the last of her Bourbon kings, established the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other governments, and tied the hands of King Louis Philippe so tightly that he was compelled to decline the request of the Pope and leave the revolution in Italy to take its course. So sense has finally come to France, and they're not going to defend the Pope. Okay? This is what a knowledgeable populace can accomplish. That's what I hope to accomplish here in the United States if given adequate voice and an adequate ear. This is the sense that finally came to France after having so much trouble with the Jesuits manipulating and meddling in government, trying to usurp the Pope's authority over the state government, the state authority. France has finally learned her lesson, and she's not going to interfere with these revolutionists in Italy, who, like France, were sick and tired of the Pope's oppressions. Now, the historian de Montour says what is true, that the revolution in France had, quote, encouraged the rebellion, unquote, in Italy, which only proves that the Roman Catholics of Italy were apt imitators of their French brethren, dreading revolution as little and as resolutely determined to avenge their own wrongs. So Italy's manning up, just like France did, manning up to stand up against this Antichrist in the Vatican. He says, manifestly they saw nothing in the faith of the primitive church in support of the temporal power. And you will not find one word in the Scripture that demands that we obey a secular prince as a matter of divine right. Now, many people will quote me Romans chapter 13, but we're talking about legitimate governments. We're not talking about governments who are not subservient to Christ, but to governments who are subservient to the papacy. And that is what I declare the United States government is. It answers to the Pope and not to Christ. It's not a legitimate government any longer. It does not rule for the benefit of its people. It rules for the benefit of the papacy, the biblical Antichrist. And it is our Christian duty to withstand this Antichrist force which our government represents. Now, Gregory XVI was undoubtedly discomfited by the refusal of Louis Philippe, which he had not probably anticipated. And it left him but a single method of escaping the wrath of his own people, but one way of dispelling the clouds thickening about him and threatening a tempest. That was to cling to the doctrines of the Holy Alliance and solicit the military intervention of some power so wedded to absolute monarchy as to be willing to march its armies against any people who were patriotic enough to assail the doctrine of the divine right of kings in order to build up a government of their own. There was then but one sovereign in Europe who held himself in readiness to respond willingly to such a call as this, who kept a large standing army in preparation to overthrow and desolate any country whose people were trying to establish their own national freedom. This single sovereign was the Emperor of Austria, at whose imperial court the Jesuits were always welcome and favored guests, and every pulsation of whose heart beat in unison with their doctrines. Now, I'm going to make a comparison between Austria and the United States of America, and this one is going to stick like glue. Austria was taken in by this holy alliance between the Jesuits and the papacy and the monarchs of Europe, determined to maintain the union of church and state and the monarchical form of government as opposed to the heretical constitutional forms of government. This nation, Austria, maintained a huge standing army that was held at the ready to rescue the Pope from any revolutionary force, including the Italian people. And it was the Pope that called upon this military power, Austria, bound by the Holy Alliance, to come and rescue the papacy from this revolution and to reassert his spiritual and temporal power over the Italian people. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the role of the United States today. A huge, technologically advanced military colossus that stands at the ready to be called upon at any time by the papacy to avenge the papacy and to restore and to extend the papal dominions and to put down any people that rebel against the authority of the Pope. Look, the Gulf War was a Holy Roman crusade. Our government now admits Saddam Hussein in Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. So what was the real motive for this military colossus known as the United States, the equivalent of Austria at this time? What was America's real business in Iraq? Was somehow Saddam Hussein opposed to the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order? I can tell you that 9/11 was an inside job. After studying for years the details that have come to light about 9/11, it is virtually impossible for our government not to have been involved in 9/11. Our own government did 9/11 and then blamed it on Muslims and then took it upon themselves to start first a crusade in Iraq, which they now admit have absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. Why won't the people of the United States, as the people of Italy and France and Spain and Portugal and all the European nations, man up against this papal oppressor that uses our blood, our sweat, our tears, our wealth, and everything that is America to finance this military colossus that stands at the ready to go on a crusade anywhere in the world that the Pope needs one? When will we finally wake up and man up and realize that the papacy is not a legitimate temporal power anywhere in the world, and that above and beyond even that, he has no spiritual power in the world either. And that means he has no jurisdiction, no divine right jurisdiction anywhere in the world. Not even Vatican City. It ought to be an outrage. It ought to be a matter of revolution when a president of the United States or any head of state of this country goes to the Vatican for any purpose. It ought to incite the Protestant Revolution in this country every time an American president or congressman launches a pilgrimage to the Vatican. It ought to be a conflict of interest to be a civil ruler in this country and to make a pilgrimage to the Vatican. And you know the presidents of the United States have made so many trips to the Vatican that Air Force One knows its way there automatically. She's just like an old nag sitting out in the hangar, and all the president has to do is board and kick her in the flanks, and she just marches right off to Rome. She can find her own way, just like a horse can find her own way back to the barn. You just go to Google video or Google Images and punch in the name of any head of state anywhere in the world. Punch in the name of any president or king or queen, and then the word Pope. And you'll see they all go to Rome wearing black in sign of submission and penitence. And even their women wear veils to cover their faces in shame before this so-called vicar of Christ. These people who are supposed to represent us, why do they go to Rome in a condition of a penitent? And what do they talk about when they get there? The wars of the world are planned in those meetings, which the press is not allowed to cover. And they come home to this country with plans and thoughts in their heads that they got from the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, and they fully intend to implement those plans because they believe the Pope is the divine right ruler of the world. And as a head of state, a secular head of state, they have to pay their allegiance to the Pope. And that's what they do. They lie to us when they take their oaths. They go to the microphones before the cameras of the world and know that when they swear their oath, they have absolutely no intention of fulfilling that oath because they are absolved of that oath before they ever take it. The papacy controls the kings of the earth. The Vatican is called that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth, and the facts on the ground, the visible facts on the ground, testify to the accuracy of the Bible. Now let us benefit from its wisdom and recognize the government of the United States not as a servant of the people, especially not God's people in this country, but served their vicar of Christ in Rome, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist who seeks to annihilate anyone who opposes either his spiritual or temporal power in the world, and claims a jurisdiction that has no end, that extends over heaven, the earth, and the underworld. It's reality. It's not a pipe dream. It's not conspiracy theory. It's history. All of history. And it's the Bible. The Bible does not leave us in ignorance of this man called the Pope. And history proves that the Bible tells the absolute, God's honest truth. And if we love the world so much and care so much for our worldly lives, not to embrace these spiritual truths and fight for them, then we will just deserve the iron chains of Rome, just like the rest of the world. It's going to take a revolutionary spirit, but more than that, it's going to take biblical understanding, spiritual conviction in defense of Christ and against Antichrist for any revolution to succeed. You can't throw off the temporal power of the Pope and expect the Pope to remain a spiritual power in the world. Because if you do, the Pope has a divine right, according to his spiritual power, to seize on the temporal power by any force available to him. And that's what he has done throughout history. Austria, in this case, is the United States at that period of time. It says, there was then but one sovereign in Europe who held himself in readiness to respond willingly to such a call as this, who kept a large standing army in preparation to overrun and desolate any country whose people were trying to establish their own national freedom. This single sovereign was the Emperor of Austria, at whose imperial court the Jesuits were always welcome and favored guests. Do you realize the United States of America is the only nation on the face of the earth that has never evicted the Jesuits from its shores? They have always been a friend in this country and welcome in the highest halls of government. No action has ever been taken against the Jesuits. They have free reign, and you just gotta know.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.